I'm joined today by Ron Leibman of McCarter English. Ron, welcome.
Okay. Thank you for having me today. It's a pleasure.
Our topic today is the future of supply chains after the pandemic. And I'd like to hear your opinion on what are the big, first of all, legal issues out there that might arise as companies are making adjustments to their supply chains in response to the coronavirus pandemic.
Well, I think a lot came up early. People talk a lot about force majeure, whether or not contracts could be broken, so much on PPP and what came out of the CARES Act, and there was huge amounts of legal work on that. Questions about, of course, layoffs in one act and all the things you have to do to deal with that. But there hasn't been, fortunately or unfortunately, there was not a lot of government guidance on that. It was sort of like old law. But looking forward, I think there's a couple of key things. I think we have a shot to see a lot of litigation. I think that companies are going to look back and feel that they were harmed by breaches of contract or lack of correct supply or improper allocation of goods. And they're going to look, of course, to try to recoup. So I could see that. And I see for lawyers, the question is going to be, how do you deal with these supply chain related suits, which are a little bit unusual coming out of a pandemic, obviously. Labor and employment, we talked about all these layoffs and such. Will something come out of that? We have so much food delivery. Will we see any kind of consumer suits coming out of, prox liability even, improper packaging, anything like that, considering there's so little FDA and CDC guidance on that. But I think, there's some good things also. There's much talk about people looking at supply chain resiliency and looking back on what's happened. And I think that'll be a big place for legal work. There'll be renegotiations of contracts. There'll be a lot of work as we change jurisdictions, possibly, to look at how does the law change. There will be questions of contracting with modal providers, contracting with suppliers, across the board, from start to finish. So I think you're going to see a lot of new work in the contract field that we're not used to.
But kind of a legal mess going forward, maybe in the months ahead. You mentioned force majeure, and I imagine there were a number of force majeure clauses stuck into these contracts. Maybe nobody gave them that serious a thought when it comes to a global pandemic. But are suppliers going to be calling on those clauses now to kind of sweep the table of any liability whatsoever for interruption of supply, and will they succeed?
Well, some have already, and whether or not they will succeed is, I wish it was an easy answer, but it's not. Force majeure sounds like a simple thing. There was an act of God, it happened, I'm not performing. However, the law doesn't treat it that way. For example, in New York, you have to be very specific. So there are actually cases where it doesn't say pandemic in your clause, it may not be effective. Every state is a little different. I mean, you can group them to some degree. So the first question becomes, what law are you under? Then there becomes a question of nexus. Simply having a pandemic is not enough unless you can show that the pandemic caused a negative trait that caused you not to be able to perform. So a lot of people said, oh, there's a pandemic, it's an act of God. Well, first question is it or isn't it? And I'm talking legally, not how we would think colloquially.
Right.
And then secondly, what was the effect coming out of the pandemic? And it's going to be highly fact sensitive. That's why there's an expectation of a significant amount of litigation.
Yeah. Do you think that companies have learned their lessons? So many of them base their sourcing decisions on cost, on where the cheapest labor and cheapest production countries were. Now, do you think they're going to be taking other things into consideration when they decide how and where to source their manufacturing?
I think that's going to be the biggest change we see on sort of a global scale, talking about globalization. But I think folks are going to want to be able to be nimble and to be able to quickly affect change. And as we've seen, all the eggs in one basket in one jurisdiction can be deadly, for lack of a better word. Now, this is a little different. Let's face it, this is business resiliency where the entire world shut down. I believe 185 countries shut down. So that's not simply moving, well, if I'm in China, I'll move to India or I'll bring stuff back. That's really a question of what can we actually expect to happen? What can we do to minimize this? And when I look at that, there's only two answers. One is near sourcing to a place like Mexico. The other is insourcing back to the US. So my feeling is you're going to see more manufacturing here. You're going to see more warehousing here, forward warehousing, making sure we have safety stocks. I think the government is going to push very hard on that with the medical devices and drugs, items like that viewed necessary, maybe military goods, that there's going to be redundancy in the United States, in Mexico. Canada's a possibility too. I think you're also going to see people looking at transparency and a government friendly to us or not. And I'm not doing this politically. I mean, this is a reality. And so I could even see large overscale manufacturing or sourcing that is done in places like China moving to another large low-cost center like India.
Mm-hmm. So other parts of Asia may benefit, but I'm wondering though, is there really a replacement for China in terms of the scale and the cost of producing there? There is no other country where you can have manufacturing facilities that employ tens of thousands of workers. Can China really be replaced?
Well, there's this theory that goes around about global movement of manufacturing that started in the West, moved east. I remember when Japan was the low-cost alternative. And now there's China. But as a middle class grows and there's a want for goods, and China certainly has an upper class, some of the richest people in the world are there or here, the question becomes, where does it go next? Well, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and there's tremendous talk, and this is why China's investing so much, I believe, in Africa. That there you have a new huge source of labor, and there's a relatively skilled portion of that labor. So when you look in a place like Lagos, or if you look at some of the large cities, you have highly skilled people, and you also have the unskilled people in large masses. So do I think it could happen in the short term? No. Do I think it will happen with, as I said, essential goods? Yes. I don't see companies putting them in this position again. So as I said, they're either going to manufacture here or they're going to forward buy. And no matter what we say, cost per piece is always going to be an important factor. Forward buying is expensive, inventory holding costs. So I think you will see more manufacturing capability in this country.
Yeah, but as you point out, because this was a global pandemic, supplier diversification isn't the lesson you take away from this particular incident. And yet future such disruptions may very well be more geographically specific, as we've seen with floods and tsunamis and earthquakes and the like around the world. So even though this was global in scope, do you think that companies will get smarter about diversifying supply to supplier sourcing going forward?
For my client base, I'm already seeing it. A number of my larger companies are already looking at their resiliency plans, already looking to contract for additional warehouse space in the US, Mexico, or if they're overseas, my overseas clients in the places where they are selling goods. And so I think it is being looked at, but a quick statistic, just to give you an idea. It's been 20 years that we've been thinking, maybe more, we've been thinking about business resiliency, supply chain resiliency. And yet there was a study done, I forget who it was by, I think in late March, where a large number of companies in this country were contacted to see if they were affected by COVID. And they said 77% said yes. 44% of the total, not just the 77%, had no resiliency program in place. The second thing is, a lot of companies, particularly big ones, have these very nice programs. They write it once and it stays. They also look to downsource it to other companies who contractually sign off, but very rarely are audited to see whether they can comply or if they do comply.
Yeah, sub-suppliers up for additional tiers, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and even where, yes. So I think what we've learned is that supply chain resiliency has to become a corporate goal and part of the corporate culture on an ongoing basis, and that we have to be more careful who we are doing business with, not just by country, by distance, by how they manufacture, but can they actually meet our plans and our needs if we were to have another pandemic?
Yeah. And I guess the question is, how long are these lessons learned? Do we have short memories or not? But maybe as a result of this one, our memories will be a little bit longer, and maybe some of these changes you're proposing will be more permanent.
I think that is a great point that I think many pundits are not talking about. I think we've all agreed the kinds of changes that will come out of this or potentially come out of this. But think about 9/11. I lived just outside the city. As a matter of fact, I watched one of the towers go down from a road called Route 280. And people for a year or two were looking over their shoulders and worried, and then everyone went back to normal. Superstorm Sandy blew down the Jersey coast and Long Island coast. Go there now. People are rebuilding in the same spots, whether or not they can be insured. It really depends, I think, on two things. A, how demand comes back, and will that demand accept potential increases in price? Because while I believe companies are willing to give up a shekel or two in order to get better resiliency, they still have to report to stockholders, report to investors. And so I think at some point, there's going to be a balancing point that's going to have to be found.
Well, I guess we will see. But Ron Leibman, I want to thank you so much for being with us today and giving us kind of an idea of where companies might be positioning their supply chains going forward as a result of the pandemic. Ron, thank you so much for being with us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you so much. My pleasure. And I'm always happy to deal with you guys. Thanks so much.